following training video is going to be taken from LSAT test number 93. It will be regarding the weekends question. As we stated earlier, the weekend question is, we're going to weaken the economist's reasoning by selecting the question objective tool. We quickly learned that the most prominent language is which one of the following most weakens the economist's reasoning. I'm going to go ahead and select the fluid text editor tool. I will copy and paste this above the answers. Just as a reminder, you can use the annotate tool to remind myself that I am looking for one of these answers here. Just go ahead and read the argument. The economist states, our country needs as much capital as possible from overseas investors in order to sustain our economy. Hence, we cannot afford any reduction in the amount of capital that overseas investors have invested there. Therefore, to sustain our economy, we should pass laws making it much more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital. So, relative to the argument structure, we are trying to weaken, use the arrow tool here, we are trying to weaken the reason. So we're looking for a reason in the paragraph and also reason in the conclusion. Let's not forget that they have two locations. So if we take a look at this particular passage and use the fluid text editor tool, and I'm going to highlight this portion. I think it's interesting that we have sub-conclusion and a conclusion. We have this particular conclusion, which we can see begins with therefore, for this other conclusion, which begins with hence. So if we go ahead and highlight this, move it over here, and we highlight this, move it over here, it appears that this particular topic sentence, once copied and pasted, kind of get a clearer picture of how this is organized. Here's a statement relative to our passage. Our country needs as much capital as possible from overseas investors to sustain our economy. So to sustain the economy, we need capital. And we take a look at our answers. We know that when we read them, overseas investors seems to play a big role in the two sub-conclusions. So let's just take a look at our highlighter tool. And we see we have, first of all, I'm going to pull this out. Overseas investors seems to be very important. Overseas investors, again, plays a role. Overseas investors plays a role throughout each sentence. So let's just use the highlighter tool. I'm going to highlight the word overseas investors. And I see that answer A does not contain one of the most prominent ideas here in order to weaken their reasoning about needing capital from overseas investors. So this is the main idea. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate answer A. To sustain its economy, the country needs to diversify its investments more evenly across the country's industries. Just to let you know, with the whiteboard tool, we never said anything about our industries in the country. So once again, and again, it doesn't have overseas investors, so I'll deselect the tool and I'm going to deselect that answer. Once again, I'll look at the fluid text editor and, excuse me, I want to take the highlighter tool. When I look at overseas investors, I see that we have it in the remaining 4 sentences. Let's go down to answer E. 2 years ago, the country enacted laws that placed some restriction on the removal of capital by overseas investors. This is a very interesting preface here. The adverbial phrase puts all this in the past because here's the past tense verb. But relative to this sentence, we cannot afford any reduction in capitals that have invested here. This is occurring in the present. So to sustain our economy, we should pass laws making it much more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital. So this past tense idea does not currently does not have the current time frame in mind. We're going to go ahead and deselect this one. As we check out answer B, we'll inspect several things here. First of all, we have to remember that we do have overseas investors. This particular one had overseas investors again, and we had this particular idea that had overseas investors built into it twice. So if we take a look at this particular sentence, laws that would make it more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital, we know that the country needs as much capital as possible. And here, they're saying that if we made it more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital, would strongly discourage them from investing any additional capital. So our country needs as much capital. This particular item would not give us any additional capital. So this would weaken the reasoning for the economy and overseas investors. So if you pass laws making it much more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital, it looks like this pertains to the same law. Let's go ahead and highlight the term law. And we see that only 2 of our remaining answers talk about law. We have this one. Oops, let me deselect that. So we have laws here, and we have laws here. I think these are the only 2 places where we see in our conclusion the word laws. So I'm going to get rid of, especially with this historical periods, this has a time element down here that we eliminated with 2 years ago. Historical periods is pretty close to being in the same context of time as 2 years ago. So we're going to eliminate this. We have 2 left. So to sustain our economy, we should pass laws making it much more difficult Well, let's take a look and see if we can take all of this, copy and paste it, and see if we can match any of this. Laws that would make it much more difficult for overseas investors to remove their capital would strongly discourage them from investing any additional capital. So if we are going to need as much capital as possible, it looks like this particular answer would weaken this reason because the investors are not going to give any more capital. So I'm going to go ahead and select this answer, and it is correct.